Okay, so you want to own a zoo. Families lined up at the gate every weekend, kids pressing their faces against the glass at feeding time, a gift shop selling stuffed lions on the way out. It looks like one of the most charming small businesses you could possibly build. Animals and admission tickets repeat forever. Here's what that charming picture doesn't show you. One zoo, made famous by one of the most watched documentaries ever released, spent years racking up federal citations for broken enclosures and inadequate care, got hit with $1 million court judgment, tried to dodge paying it by dissolving itself and reincorporating under a new name overnight, and still ended up permanently shut down, its exhibitor's license forfeited, by the same federal agency that's supposed to keep a business like this honest in the first place. The animals never stopped being profitable to look at. The business underneath them stopped working long before the doors actually closed. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly why owning living, breathing inventory is nothing like owning any other kind of retail stock. That contrast, wildly popular with the public and simultaneously falling apart financially and ethically, isn't actually a contradiction once you understand how this industry's economics really work. It's the single most predictable outcome of running a business whose core cost never pauses, never goes on sale, and never stops accumulating the moment revenue gets tight. A structural reality this video is going to walk through piece by piece, starting with the basic question of what you're actually buying when you buy a zoo in the first place. People think a zoo is an entertainment business, a place you build enclosures, put animals in them, and sell tickets to see them. In reality, it's closer to running a permanent, extremely specialized hospital and hospice system that happens to also be open to the public. Every animal in your care is a fixed cost the moment it arrives and stays a fixed cost. Food, veterinary care, specialized staff, enrichment for the rest of its natural life, whether or not a single paying visitor ever looks at it again. You can't discount a slow-moving animal to clear inventory. You can't return it to a supplier. It's a living expense with a multi-decade time horizon. And understanding that single fact, that your product doesn't stop costing money the moment it stops being popular, explains almost everything else in this video. Compare that to almost any other physical retail business and the difference becomes obvious immediately. A clothing store that overbought a particular style can mark it down, bundle it, or eventually write it off entirely, and the unsold stock stops costing anything meaningful the moment it leaves the shelf. A car dealership can move slow-selling inventory to another lot or wholesale it to another dealer. A zoo's inventory eats every single day it's alive, requires medical attention on its own schedule rather than yours, and for a large mammal can remain on the books for 30, 40, sometimes 50 years after the last time it drove a meaningful spike in attendance. There's no version of this business where you simply stop carrying the cost of an asset that stopped performing. An AZA-accredited zoo operates under the Association of Zoos and Aquariums, the industry's own gold standard certification, and there are remarkably few of them, only around 240 facilities across the entire United States, and a handful of other countries hold that accreditation at any given time. It's a genuinely difficult bar to clear, so difficult that when the association made accreditation mandatory back in 1985, roughly 3/4 of its existing membership couldn't meet the new standard and dropped out in a single year. A USDA-licensed, non-accredited facility, sometimes called a roadside zoo, operates legally under a much lower bar, a basic exhibitor's license from the Department of Agriculture that covers minimum standards for enclosure size, food, and veterinary access, without the far more rigorous animal welfare, conservation, and staffing requirements AZA accreditation demands. Legal doesn't mean safe, and it doesn't mean sustainable, a distinction that matters enormously later in this video. A municipal or city-owned zoo operates as a public-private partnership, land and often a meaningful share of the operating budget coming from local government, with a non-profit society or foundation running day-to-day operations and fundraising to cover the rest. And a safari park or drive-through wildlife park skips traditional enclosures almost entirely, letting animals roam larger open areas while visitors observe from vehicles, a fundamentally different capital structure built around acreage rather than exhibit construction. This video mostly follows the traditional AZA accredited model, because it's the version most people picture when they imagine owning a real zoo, and it's where the gap between the business's public mission and its actual financial mechanics is easiest to see clearly. Underneath all four categories sits the same basic choice every founder in this business eventually confronts: build for accreditation from day one, accepting years of additional cost and scrutiny before you can even apply, or open faster and cheaper under the minimum legal license, keeping the option to pursue accreditation later once the business has proven it can survive. Almost every long-lived, financially healthy institution in this industry chose the first path. Almost every cautionary tale chose the second, not necessarily out of bad intent, but because the second path is genuinely faster and cheaper to open, right up until the corners it required cutting start showing up in a federal inspection report. Land and enclosure construction dominate the opening bill, and the ranges here are enormous depending on species. A single new immersive exhibit habitat at an established zoo, the kind built to modern animal welfare standards with naturalistic terrain, climate control, and visitor viewing infrastructure, routinely costs in the tens of millions of dollars for one exhibit alone, and a full new facility from bare land can run into the hundreds of millions before a single visitor walks through the gate. Animal acquisition itself is its own category of complexity that has almost nothing in common with buying retail inventory. Many species, especially anything endangered or federally protected, aren't simply purchased on an open market. They move between accredited institutions through cooperative breeding programs specifically designed to preserve genetic diversity across the entire captive population, meaning a new zoo isn't just writing a check, it's applying to join a decades-old, tightly managed institutional network that decides which animals go where based on genetics, not who's willing to pay the most. Then there's the specialized infrastructure almost nobody budgets for accurately on a first attempt. Quarantine facilities, veterinary hospitals equipped for species ranging from a hummingbird to an elephant, backup power systems that cannot fail because an HVAC outage in the wrong exhibit can kill an animal within hours, and species-specific enrichment equipment that has to be replaced and redesigned continuously to keep animals psychologically healthy in captivity, not just physically alive. Staffing has to be in place, licensed and trained before the first animal even arrives on site, not phased in gradually the way a retail business might scale up its headcount alongside early sales. Regulators expect a fully qualified veterinary and keeper staff ready to receive and care for an animal the moment it's transported in, which means a founder is paying full specialized payroll for months before a single paying visitor generates $1 of revenue, layered directly on top of the construction and acquisition costs already described. Location works differently in this business than in almost any other in this genre, because a zoo needs two contradictory things simultaneously: enough nearby population to sustain admission and membership revenue, and enough contiguous acreage to house large animals humanely, land that's genuinely difficult to find in exactly the kind of dense metro area that provides the visitor base in the first place. A large mammal collection can require dozens of acres on its own once modern naturalistic habitat standards are factored in. Land that, inside a major city, competes directly with residential and commercial development for the same limited parcels. That tension is exactly why so many of the country's oldest, most successful zoos sit on land they acquired generations ago, when a city was smaller and undeveloped acreage on its outskirts was cheap. Land that would be functionally impossible to assemble at anything resembling the original price today. A new entrant into this business doesn't have that luxury. Building a genuinely large-scale zoo from scratch today usually means locating farther from the dense population center that would otherwise drive the strongest attendance, accepting a longer average visitor drive time, or paying a dramatically higher price for land close enough to a city to make the traffic numbers work. A trade-off that shapes a new zoo's entire financial model before a single exhibit gets designed. Zoning and permitting add their own layer of location-specific risk. Housing large, sometimes dangerous exotic animals close to residential neighborhoods draws exactly the kind of public hearing, environmental review, and community opposition that can add years and real legal costs to a project before construction even begins. Risk that barely exists for most other businesses choosing a physical location. A zoo isn't just picking a spot on a map, it's picking a spot that has to satisfy zoning boards, environmental regulators, and often a skeptical set of nearby residents, all before it can satisfy a single paying visitor. That 240 facility number from the last section is worth sitting with because it reveals something almost unique about this industry. The gap between the minimum legal bar and the industry's own respected standard is enormous, and crossing it is genuinely difficult on purpose. AZA accreditation requires a facility to pass detailed review across animal welfare, veterinary care, conservation contribution, safety, staffing qualifications, and financial stability, evaluated by a team that includes veterinarians and zoo professionals from outside your own organization, and it has to be renewed on a recurring cycle rather than earned once and kept forever. That's a meaningfully higher bar than the baseline federal licensing requirement, which mostly checks enclosure size, food, and basic veterinary access. A facility can be entirely legal, holding a valid USDA exhibitor's license, running paying tours every single day, while never coming close to meeting AZA's standard, and the public overwhelmingly cannot tell the difference just by walking through the gate. Both facilities have animals in enclosures. Both sell tickets. Only one of them has voluntarily submitted to the kind of scrutiny that makes long-term institutional trust, breeding program access, and conservation partnerships possible. And that difference in trust is exactly what separates a business that can raise capital, attract donors, and plan multi-decade exhibit investments from one that can't. The accreditation cycle itself is worth understanding because it means this is never a box a facility checks once and forgets. Institutions must undergo full reaccreditation review on a recurring basis, typically every 5 years, involving a fresh, multi-day on-site inspection by a completely new panel of outside professionals rather than a simple paperwork renewal. That structure exists specifically so that a facility can't earn accreditation once, coast on the reputation indefinitely, and quietly let standards slip over the following decade. It also means accreditation itself becomes a genuine, recurring cost of doing business. Staff time preparing documentation, facility investments made specifically to satisfy updated standards, and the very real possibility of losing accredited status entirely if a review finds the institution has fallen short since the last cycle. Feeding costs alone can be staggering at scale. One major metropolitan zoo caring for roughly 5,000 animals across more than 300 species reported spending close to $1 million a year just on food. A number that assumes normal operations and doesn't include the specialized diets required for animals with particular nutritional or medical needs. Staffing is unusually specialized compared to almost any other business in this genre. You're not simply hiring cashiers and ticket takers. You need trained zookeepers certified in handling specific species, veterinarians and vet technicians equipped for everything from a parakeet to a rhinoceros, a nutritionist designing individualized diets across dozens of species simultaneously, and security and safety staff trained specifically for animal-related emergencies, none of which is a role you can fill quickly or cheaply if someone leaves. Insurance for this industry carries its own premium entirely, covering not just standard property and liability risk, but the specific, elevated risk of housing dangerous or exotic animals in a facility the public walks through every single day. And veterinary care for large or exotic species isn't comparable to a neighborhood vet clinic bill. Specialized imaging, anesthesia protocols calibrated by body weight that can run from a few pounds to several tons, and surgical procedures that sometimes require flying in outside specialists, all of it billed at a scale that would sound implausible for a house pet. Enrichment, the ongoing behavioral and environmental stimulation required to keep captive animals psychologically healthy, is its own recurring line item most people never think about at all. Modern animal welfare standards require regularly rotating novel objects, scents, puzzle feeders, and environmental changes tailored to each species' natural behaviors. A continuous design and fabrication effort that scales with the size and complexity of the collection rather than shrinking in a slow month. Since a bored, understimulated animal in captivity isn't just an ethical failure, it's a welfare and safety risk that accreditation reviewers specifically look for. There's a detail about animal ownership in this industry that surprises almost everyone outside it. At an accredited zoo, you often don't fully own the animals in your own exhibits in the way you'd own inventory in any other business. Many endangered and threatened species are managed under what's called a species survival plan, a cooperative breeding and genetic management program coordinating which animals breed with which across every participating accredited institution in the country, specifically to prevent the kind of inbreeding that would otherwise doom a small captive population within a few generations. That means a zoo can be told, by the coordinating body overseeing a given species, that a specific animal in its own collection needs to move to a different institution hundreds of miles away for breeding purposes, or that the zoo isn't authorized to breed a specific pair at all this year because the program's genetic modeling says their offspring wouldn't meaningfully help the population's diversity. It's a genuinely unusual constraint for a business to operate under. the single most visible, most beloved individual animal in your collection, the one bringing families back to renew their membership year after year, can be reassigned by an outside coordinating committee for reasons that have nothing to do with what's best for your specific zoo's attendance numbers. This system exists because it works, genuinely, at the level of species survival. Several species that had dwindled to critically low numbers in the wild owe their continued existence directly to coordinated captive breeding across accredited institutions working together rather than competing for the same limited gene pool. But it also means the animal acquisition side of this business runs on an entirely different logic than any retail supply chain. You can't simply order more of a popular endangered species because attendance data says visitors love it. You get what the coordinated program determines your facility's habitat, genetics, and institutional track record actually qualify you to responsibly house. International movement of animals adds another layer of friction almost no other retail business ever encounters. Moving an endangered species across a national border, even between two fully accredited institutions cooperating on the same breeding program, typically requires permits under international wildlife trade treaties, health certifications, and quarantine periods that can stretch the process out over many months, with real transport costs for specialized climate-controlled crating, veterinary escorts, and, for larger animals, custom-built shipping containers designed around a single animal's specific welfare needs for the duration of the trip. A zoo trying to bring in a single animal from a partner institution overseas can spend a meaningful sum and the better part of a year on logistics and paperwork alone, before that animal ever sets foot in its new exhibit. Here's the genuinely uncomfortable structural reality sitting underneath the breeding program system. One accredited zoos work hard to manage responsibly, and unaccredited ones have historically handled far more carelessly. Successful breeding produces more offspring than any zoo has permanent space or genetic need for, and every animal born into this system still needs somewhere to actually live for the rest of its life, sometimes several more decades for a large mammal. Accredited institutions handle this through careful, coordinated placement, transferring surplus animals to other accredited facilities with appropriate space and genetic need. A slow, deliberate, expensive process that prioritizes the animal's long-term welfare over speed. Unaccredited operations, historically, have had far less rigorous options, and this is precisely the gap that's drawn the most sustained criticism from animal welfare organizations. Cubs and other young animals bred specifically to be popular with paying visitors during their brief marketable infancy, then facing a much murkier set of options once they age out of being small and photogenic. Exactly the pattern investigators have flagged repeatedly at facilities operating outside the accredited system, where the incentive to keep breeding new, visitor-friendly babies can outpace any responsible plan for where those animals actually live once they're grown. Admission is the layer everyone assumes carries the whole business, and at most zoos it's actually a minority of total revenue, not the majority. Ticket sales typically anchor the model, but memberships, often priced to pay for themselves after just 2 or 3 visits a year, convert one-time visitors into a predictable, recurring revenue base that smooths out the seasonal swings a pure admission model would otherwise be exposed to entirely. Concessions, retail, and parking layer on top of that. The same loss leader on the ticket, real margin on everything else structure that shows up across almost every business in the genre. Special event rentals, private evening bookings, corporate functions held among the exhibits after hours can generate outsized margin relative to the space used, since the animals and infrastructure are already there and paid for regardless. For AZA-accredited nonprofit structured zoos specifically, there's a funding layer that has no real equivalent in most other businesses in the genre: direct public subsidy. Municipal and state governments frequently fund a meaningful share of a zoo's operating budget directly, recognizing the institution as a public good rather than a purely commercial enterprise. One state-run zoo reported an annual operating budget near $30 million, with roughly a third of that coming directly from state funding and the remaining 2/3 earned through admission, memberships, and the rest of the revenue layers already described. That public backstop is a genuine structural advantage over a purely private roadside operation, and it's also a dependency. When a state budget tightens or when a crisis eliminates gate revenue entirely, that earned 2/3 can evaporate overnight while the animals still need to eat. Philanthropic giving and endowment income round out the picture for well-established institutions. Capital campaigns funding a specific new exhibit, individual major donors sponsoring a specific animal's care in exchange for naming recognition, and, for the oldest and most prestigious zoos, an actual investment endowment generating a predictable annual return independent of that year's attendance entirely. That kind of financial layer takes decades to build, and is precisely the buffer a newer or unaccredited facility doesn't have. Meaning two zoos can look outwardly similar on a normal Tuesday afternoon, while one of them has months of reserve capital sitting behind it, and the other is functionally living paycheck to paycheck off that week's gate revenue. Here's where the arithmetic gets genuinely unforgiving. Because unlike almost any other business in this genre, your core costs don't scale down when revenue does. Take a modest facility built around big cats specifically, since real cost breakdowns exist publicly for exactly this scenario. Annual animal upkeep, feeding, and healthcare combined can run north of $160,000 even for a relatively small population. Add basic labor, and total costs for a genuinely minimal operation can land close to $230,000 a year before a single additional expense, cage maintenance, property tax, marketing, gets added on top. Walk the break-even arithmetic through directly. At a modest $25 ticket price, a common rate for smaller regional facilities, covering that $230,000 cost base requires something in the range of 9,200 paying visitors a year just to reach zero profit, before the owner has taken home a single dollar for the work of actually running the place. Push toward an actual livable income, and the visitor count climbs well past 11,000, all while every one of those underlying animal care costs stays exactly the same, regardless of whether the parking lot is full or empty on any given weekend. That's the trap sitting underneath this entire business. A bad month doesn't let you quietly reduce your cost of goods sold the way a retail store might discount slow-moving inventory. The tigers still eat, whether 9,000 people bought a ticket that year or 3,000 did. A business model that looks on a good weekend like pure profit margin on top of a fixed set of animals can, over a bad season, become a cash flow crisis with a legal and ethical obligation attached to every single day it goes unresolved. This isn't a purely theoretical risk. When a major metropolitan zoo was forced to close its gates entirely for several months during a public health emergency, it lost every dollar of admission, parking, and event revenue overnight, while its roughly 5,000 animal collection still needed to eat every single day. That specific institution responded by temporarily laying off more than half its staff, close to 60% of the workforce, just to preserve enough cash to keep feeding and caring for the animals that remained entirely dependent on it. A stark illustration of exactly how little flexibility this business has to cut its core costs the moment revenue disappears. There's a labor economics puzzle sitting inside this industry that's worth understanding on its own, because it shapes staffing risk in a way few other businesses in this genre experience. Zookeeping is genuinely skilled, often dangerous work, requiring detailed species-specific knowledge, physical stamina, and split-second judgment around animals capable of seriously injuring or killing a careless handler. It typically also requires a college degree in a biological or zoological field just to be considered for an entry-level position. And despite all of that, keeper pay across the industry sits notably below what comparable specialized technical roles command in almost any other field requiring similar education and risk tolerance. The reason isn't a mystery, and it's almost entirely about labor supply rather than the actual difficulty of the job. An enormous number of people grow up wanting to work closely with animals, which means zoos, unlike almost any other employer needing specialized technical staff, can reliably fill open keeper positions without competing hard on salary, because the emotional reward of the work itself functions as a genuine part of the total compensation package in a way it simply doesn't for most other skilled labor. That dynamic keeps payroll costs lower than they'd otherwise need to be to retain this level of expertise, which helps the entire industry's fragile economics work at all, but it also means turnover, burnout, and the loss of specialized institutional knowledge when an experienced keeper finally does leave for better pay elsewhere are constant, quietly recurring costs most zoos budget for as simply the price of doing business in this particular labor market. That same dynamic cuts both ways when accreditation and animal welfare are on the line. A well-funded, accredited institution can afford enough staff at competitive enough pay to maintain the kind of consistent, well-trained keeper coverage regulators and reviewers expect. A financially strained or unaccredited operation, running lean specifically because its underlying economics from earlier in this video are already tight, has far less room to retain experienced staff, and understaffing a facility housing genuinely dangerous animals isn't just an operational inconvenience, it's precisely the kind of gap that shows up as a safety citation, or worse, in a federal inspection report. Here's what all of this looks like once real neglect, real debt, and a real court judgment get involved. A private big cat park in rural Oklahoma, built and run for years by an owner who bred and displayed hundreds of tigers and other exotic animals, operated for 2 decades on a basic USDA exhibitor's license, never remotely close to AZA accreditation, generating revenue from gate admission and, controversially, from public handling of tiger cubs, a practice widely condemned by accredited zoos precisely because it requires a constant supply of new cubs bred faster than any legitimate conservation program would ever require. Federal inspectors cited the facility repeatedly across a period of years for exactly the kind of animal welfare failures AZA accreditation exists to prevent. Enclosure fencing and gates found leaning and sagging, creating an escape risk, a broken roof over a tiger enclosure, and inadequate shade for animals housed in direct sun. None of these were one-time violations. They recurred across multiple inspection cycles, the kind of pattern that, at an accredited facility, would trigger loss of accreditation long before it ever reached this point. The cub handling business specifically deserves a closer look, because it's the clearest example in this entire video of a revenue model quietly dictating an animal welfare outcome. Paying visitors will pay a real premium to hold, photograph, and bottle feed a tiger cub, but only during a narrow window of a few months before the animal becomes too large and dangerous for public contact. A facility built around that revenue stream has a direct financial incentive to keep a constant supply of new cubs coming, far faster than any genuine conservation or genetic management program would call for, which is exactly the concern accredited zoos and welfare organizations have raised about the practice for years. The cubs are the product. What happens to each one the moment it stops being small enough to hold was never really part of the business plan. Then came the lawsuit that turned chronic operational failure into an existential financial threat. A rival big cat sanctuary won a judgment against the park worth roughly $1 million over a trademark dispute. Rather than pay it, the park's owners dissolved the original nonprofit entity entirely and almost immediately incorporated a new foundation under a different name, transferring the animals, the property, and the ongoing operation to that new entity while explicitly leaving the debt behind with the dissolved one. The sanctuary that had won the judgment sued again, arguing, correctly, that the new organization was simply the old one wearing a different name, same staff, same animals, same income, same physical park, and eventually a court agreed, ultimately awarding control of the park itself to the same rival sanctuary that had brought the original claim. The park changed hands once more before its final chapter, and continued racking up USDA citations under its new operator, including a formal finding that animals weren't receiving adequate veterinary care. Facing mounting regulatory pressure, the operator voluntarily forfeited the exhibitor's license the entire business legally depended on and announced the park was closing to the public permanently, reframing it instead as a private film set, an explicit acknowledgement that the underlying business, animals plus paying visitors, was no longer viable to run out in the open under federal scrutiny. Estimate the basic cost structure this specific operation was likely carrying, using the kind of animal upkeep and staffing math from earlier in this video. And the numbers help explain exactly why chronic shortcuts kept showing up in federal inspection reports year after year. A population of tigers alone, fed and given veterinary care at anything resembling an adequate standard, can easily run past $160,000 a year before a single other expense enters the picture. A facility charging low general admission prices while also facing a mounting legal judgment it had no apparent ability to pay, was never going to comfortably absorb that number and also fund the enclosure repairs, staffing, and veterinary access federal inspectors kept flagging as inadequate. The corners that got cut were, in hindsight, exactly the corners the business's own cost structure was under pressure to cut. None of this happened because demand for the product ever wavered. People kept showing up, kept buying tickets, kept watching the associated media content for years after the park itself became a cultural phenomenon. The business failed anyway, not from a lack of customers, but because an operation running on the legal minimum, without accreditation, without a genuine capital cushion, and eventually without the ability to satisfy a straightforward court judgment, had no real margin left to absorb the ordinary cost of actually taking care of what it owned. There's a final structural irony worth naming directly. The documentary that made this park internationally famous, and briefly, according to its own operator, financially self-sustaining on media income alone, was itself a direct product of the same underlying business failures the video was documenting: the neglect, the legal disputes, the improvised entity restructuring. In a strange way, the park's mismanagement became more commercially valuable than the park's animals ever were as a straightforward gate admission business. A genuinely unusual outcome that doesn't remotely resemble a repeatable business model for anyone else in this industry, and that nobody should mistake for one. Put a full year on a mid-size AZA accredited zoo, starting with the version where things go according to plan. In the optimistic scenario, attendance holds steady across a full calendar of seasons, the membership base renews at a healthy rate, and a strong spring and summer generate enough concessions, event rentals, and gift shop revenue to comfortably cover the fixed costs of animal care that never take a season off. Municipal or state funding, if the zoo is publicly backed, arrives on schedule and roughly at the level budgeted. No major unplanned veterinary emergencies hit the largest, most expensive to treat animals in the collection, and no enclosure requires emergency out-of-cycle renovation. Under those conditions, the zoo comfortably covers its feeding, staffing, veterinary, and insurance costs, funds a reasonable reinvestment into exhibit maintenance, and, if privately structured, generates a genuine surplus. If nonprofit, that surplus flows back into conservation programs and future exhibits rather than an owner's pocket. But the institution itself is financially healthy, stable, and positioned to keep operating for decades. That stability compounds over time in a way genuinely unique to this industry. A well-run zoo's reputation, its accreditation record, its conservation partnerships, and its donor relationships all build on each other across decades, making it easier to raise capital for the next major exhibit, easier to attract top veterinary and animal care talent, and easier to weather a single bad year precisely because reserves and donor trust have already been established. The oldest, most respected zoos in the country are still standing after a century, in large part because that compounding trust, once built, is genuinely difficult for a newer or unaccredited competitor to replicate at any price. In the realistic scenario, 2 or 3 ordinary things go wrong at once. Nothing scandalous, just the normal friction of running a business whose core inventory is alive. A particularly hot or particularly harsh winter season depresses attendance for several consecutive weekends. Exactly the kind of weather dependency that shows up across almost every outdoor attraction in this genre. One of the zoo's most expensive animals to maintain develops a chronic health condition requiring ongoing specialized veterinary care, a cost that, unlike a mechanical repair, cannot be deferred or shopped around once it starts. And a municipal budget tightens in a difficult fiscal year, trimming the public funding share a nonprofit zoo had been counting on. None of these pressures individually would threaten a well-run institution. Stacked together, on a cost base that includes hundreds of animals who need to eat and receive care regardless of gate revenue that quarter, they can turn a comfortable, mission-sustaining surplus into a genuine cash crunch. One where deferred maintenance and quietly reduced staffing start to look worryingly like the early chapters of the case this video just walked through in detail. The uncomfortable truth is that the gap between those early warning signs and an actual welfare crisis is mostly a matter of how long the financial pressure continues, not whether it appears at all. Every zoo in this industry, accredited or not, faces some version of a bad season eventually. What separates a well-run institution from a cautionary tale isn't whether hard years happen. It's whether the institution had enough of a financial cushion, reserve funds, diversified revenue, a public funding backstop, an endowment, to treat that hard year as a temporary problem to manage rather than an existential threat that starts forcing impossible choices between animal care, staffing, and basic facility maintenance. That's the gap this business runs on. Somewhere between a stable, well-funded conservation institution and a facility one bad season and one uninsured veterinary emergency away from the exact kind of corner cutting that shows up first in a federal inspection report and later in a headline. The deciding factor was almost never whether people still wanted to see the animals. It's whether the institution built a genuine financial cushion, accreditation, diversified revenue, public backing, reserve funds, thick enough to absorb an ordinary bad year without the animal's care becoming the line item that quietly gets cut first. So this was never really a story about lions, tigers, or which zoo has the most impressive exhibit. It was a story about what happens when a business's entire inventory is alive, permanently, expensively, and non-negotiably, for years or decades after the novelty of any individual animal has worn off for the paying public walking past its enclosure. None of the formats in this video are doomed, and none of them are guaranteed. A well-capitalized, accredited institution with diversified revenue and genuine public trust can operate for a century, continuously reinvesting in animal welfare and conservation precisely because its financial foundation was built to survive an ordinary bad year without cutting corners on the one thing the entire business exists to protect. An operation running on the bare legal minimum, with no real cushion and no accreditation forcing external accountability, can look profitable on a good weekend and still be one lawsuit, one bad season, or one veterinary emergency away from federal citations, a forfeited license, and a permanently closed gate. What separated a century-old public institution from a park that had to dissolve itself to dodge a $1 million judgment was never how many people wanted to see the animals. It was whether the business ever had a real plan for the years the animals needed more than the gate could pay for. That plan is, in the end, the entire difference between the two categories described throughout this video. It isn't a difference in love for animals, and it isn't a difference in how badly either kind of owner wanted the business to work. It's whether the institution was ever built, financially, to survive being genuinely responsible for something that can't be discounted, returned, or quietly written off the moment it stops being profitable to look at. If you had $10 million to put into this industry, would you rather fund one ambitious new exhibit at an established, accredited zoo, or try to build an independent facility from scratch? Tell me in the comments. If this laid out numbers you'd never actually seen broken down before, a like helps more than you'd think. And if you want the same breakdown for another business people think they understand, subscribe. Every week, one more business that looks simpler from the outside than it actually is.